what's going on, everybody? Brent Hyden here, coming at you on this Friday morning, talking 10 games around the association. Gonna get to the games in just a moment. Before we dive into those, though, your quick reminder: please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button down below. If you're not already following me on Twitter or subscribe to my daily content package, make sure you head over to the Twitter machine. My Twitter handle at BrentHyden1 is in the description down below. Also, you can head over to my Patreon page and take advantage of the offers that I have available over there to get signed up for a monthly fee, or you can send me a direct message on Twitter and find out how you can get signed up for a very low one-time price. But without further ado, let's hop into the games. The first game that we are going to talk about tonight is Utah at Cleveland. Utah 8.5-point favorites in this one, 208.5 over under. It is not a very appealing game. We're going to get through a couple of games that just aren't terribly appealing, but there are some spots where we can still take a look. Ricky Rubio is questionable for this game, so is Matthew Dellavedova. Grayson Allen, David Nwaba, and Ante Zizic are all out. Like I said, very ugly game on paper. It's probably not going to be very appealing on the court either, but Cavaliers league worst 115.5 defensive rating. So there are some spots where we definitely want to take a look. That starts with Donovan Mitchell here. He's still in a great spot. I know he's struggled a decent amount this season. He's been really inconsistent. Still leads the team in usage. Takes a decent amount of shots in areas where Cleveland does struggle to defend. His price at $7,200 on DraftKings and $7,400 on FanDuel is really appealing, especially in tournaments. And if Ricky Rubio misses this game, obviously that would be a boost to Donovan Mitchell. So he's someone to definitely consider in the spot tonight. Ricky Rubio himself is a strong GPP option. He is a little expensive, $6,100 on DraftKings, $7K on FanDuel, but he's been playing really well of late. And it's obviously a matchup. Cleveland, one of the worst defenses against point guards in the NBA. But as you can see, again, has been playing really well, taking a lot of shots, and that's good to see. Outside of the Philly game where he did struggle with his shot, has been shooting a little bit better recently. Obviously, that 1 in 10 is dragging his averages down. But, I mean, still 45% in these couple of games, 35% in that one against Toronto. So he's been playing pretty well. So if he plays, obviously a solid tournament option. If he misses, Dante Exum, a guy that we'll definitely want to take a look at, coming in at $3,900 on DraftKings and $3,900 on FanDuel. He might even be in play if Rubio plays. Obviously, there's a potential for some blowout run, but we did see when he got the start against the Knicks, played 26 minutes, was a huge blowout, 13 points, 13 assists in that game. So I have some interest in him here tonight. You can also take a look at Joe Ingles, who's been inconsistent of late. Cleveland does rank 22nd in defensive efficiency to small forwards. Obviously, some extra shots would potentially fall his way if Ricky Rubio does miss this game. Joe Ingles, again, $5,300 on DraftKings, $5,800 on FanDuel. Again, been inconsistent. Shot hasn't been falling in a few of these games. Still taking a decent amount of shots. I still have interest in him. Jay Crowder, Derek Favors, two strong cash option favors, has been playing really well of late. His last couple games against the Knicks and the Raptors, really, really strong outings, but he's generally a good cash game option. And then Rudy Gobert, not really a whole lot I really want to say about him. Obviously, it's a good spot here. He's coming off a little bit of a down game against Toronto, but had been playing really, really well before that. He's fine in cash and tournaments. I'm just going to be looking elsewhere here tonight. I forgot Jay Crowder, revenge game. So there is that. And Cleveland is allowing opposing power forwards to shoot 51.9% from the floor and 41.4% from three. So pretty solid spot here for Jay Crowder, who is just $4,700 on DraftKings and $4,800 on FanDuel. Utah Jazz over the last 15 games, 102.0 defensive rating, second best in the NBA. That does not bode well for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Also, what does not bode well for the Cleveland Cavaliers is last game against Miami, 10 players saw 15 or more minutes, and Cedi Osman and Colin Sexton were the only two seeing even close to 30 minutes. I really don't have any interest in targeting anyone from this side of the game. Obviously, Tristan Thompson at $5,900 on DraftKings is a little bit interesting in tournaments. If we think he's going to play a few extra minutes, he's $6K on FanDuel, but I don't really see a reason to force exposure to Tristan Thompson. You can look at Alec Burks, Rodney Hood for their revenge games. and that'd be about all they have going for them, and I'm just not going to spend any more time on that one. Moving on, Indiana at Chicago. Indiana 6-point favorites in this one, 202.5 over under. Things are not looking good for Chicago after they just traded away their best, one of their best defensive players. So yeah, I have a feeling this might end up being a blowout. Miles Turner is questionable. Doug McDermott is probable. Aaron Holiday is questionable, and obviously not going to get to face off against his brother in this one. Bobby Portis is doubtful. Zach LaVine has been struggling recently, held to an average of just 14.5 points in his last 2 games. Both of those were losses. Indiana Pacers, obviously in a very, very good spot here. That starts with Victor Oladipo and Darren Collison. Victor Oladipo, 8,800 on DraftKings, 8,800 on FanDuel. One of my favorite ways to get exposure to this game. Easily one of the top plays in this spot. Comes in 28% usage rate. Has played 34 plus minutes in 6 of his last 10 games. Continues to take a lot of shots. And the interesting thing to note with Victor Oladipo is his assists. He's been really, really good as far as a playmaker. His season average for potential assist is 8.3, but over the last 10 games, he has averaged 11.7 potential assists, and what could be a high-scoring affair from the Indiana side of this game. That's pretty interesting. So I like Victor Oladipo in cash and tournaments. I do think he'll be really, really under-owned. You can look at Darren Collison, who is a little expensive, 5,600 on DraftKings, 5,900 on FanDuel. Obviously, it is a fantastic spot. He has been over 30 fantasy points in 3 straight. The Bulls obviously do struggle against point guards, ranking 27th in defensive efficiency against the position. So yeah, he's perfectly fine. With Justin Holiday being gone, I absolutely love me some Bojan Bogdanovic. Coming in at 5,400 on DraftKings and 5,500 on FanDuel. Continues to be a really, really, really strong cash game play, but I do think he has tournament upside in the spot. Just taking a lot of shots, shoots a decent amount of shots in the paint where, Chicago is struggling to defend. And as I mentioned, without Justin Holiday there, one of their better wing defenders, Bojan Bogdanovic, a pretty strong value / mid-range option here. Thaddeus Young can be considered in cash and tournaments. He'd be a pretty good play here. Could feast. Bulls ranks 19th in defensive efficiency to power forwards on the season. The status of Miles Turner is something to keep an eye on. Did have surgery on his nose a couple days ago. Has been fitted for a mask. Has gone through practice and things like that. But it's still worth noting that I think they're going to be cautious with him, and they may not rush him back in this spot. If he plays, he's perfectly fine in cash and tournaments. If he sits, Domantas Sabonis would be someone that I would be jamming in as many lineups as possible. Both these guys are a little bit pricey. Sabonis 7K, Miles Turner 7,600. We know centers continue to just destroy Chicago. Chicago ranks 28th in defensive efficiency to the position. They're giving up like 48 rebounds per game. Miles Turner would be a very, very strong cash and tournament option in this spot tonight. So would Domantas Sabonis. Looking at the Chicago side of things, oh, I forgot. You can play Corey Joseph in like tournaments or as a value. Could get extra run if this game blows out. Looking at the Chicago side of things, I don't have a lot of interest in here. Pacers first in defense at 99.6 points per game, or 99.6 defensive rating over the last 15. Larry Markkanen's really the only guy here on my radar, and if Chicago can somehow keep this thing close, he could have a really good game. Actually had a good game against Indiana earlier. Earlier this season, 32 minutes, 43.5 fantasy points. It was early on whenever he had just returned from his injury. Just a little bit too cheap, I think, for his role in this offense. Double-digit field goal attempts in all but one of his last 10 games. Pacers do allow 9th most fantasy points per game to power forwards, and without Justin Holiday there, we know he could get a couple extra minutes, a couple extra shots. That could bode pretty well for Larry Markkinen, and I think he'll be really, really overlooked. LaVine Dunn, Wendell Carter, you can use in tournaments. There's no reason to force exposure to the Bulls here. Chandler Hutchison and Shaq Harrison would be the names to keep an eye on. Both guys could fall into extra minutes. Chandler Hutchison at 3K, probably going to be a chalky value option. I currently have him projected at 32 minutes, and that puts him at like 16 fantasy points. Again, it's a terrible, terrible, terrible matchup, but Chandler Hutchison at 3K is a somewhat appealing value here tonight. And again, Shaq Harrison, someone else to keep an eye on. Both of those guys perfectly fine on FanDuel where you can drop their score. Moving on, Washington at Miami. Miami 7-point favorites in this one, 214.5 over under. John Wall is out, Goran Dragic is out, Dwight Howard is out, Markieff Morris is out, and Dwayne Wade is questionable for this game. That's going to open some things up. Again, Washington side of this game, not as appealing as I would like, but there are still some options we can consider, and that starts with, of course, Bradley Beal did kind of let everyone down last game against Atlanta. Price is up to 9,200 on DraftKings, and he is 9,700 on FanDuel. Still a pretty safe bet for 40-plus fantasy points in this spot. Owns a 33.3% usage rate, averages 1.37 fantasy points per minute. When you take all these guys off the floor, kind of has the keys to the offense himself. Miami does rank 25th in defensive efficiency to shooting guards this season, and Bradley Beal has actually played pretty well against Miami, averaging just shy of a fantasy point per minute in the 2 games that they've played already this season. I do have interest in Bradley Beal. He still is a pretty strong cash and tournament option. Same with Tomas Satoransky, who's coming off a really, really strong game, averaging 17 points and 6.5 assists over his last 2 games. Just 2 turnovers in that span. Still someone that we can look at in cash and in tournaments. 5,800 on DraftKings, 6,400 on FanDuel. If Washington keeps this game close, he's going to play a buttload of minutes, and that's really appealing in this spot. He's someone else, has not played very much against Miami. Games have not been able to stay close, but he's someone to consider. Trevor Ariza continues to be a very, 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 very good cash game option. 5,800 on DraftKings, 6,300 on FanDuel, just because he's playing a ton of minutes. 40, 41, 39, 38. These are minute totals for Trevor Ariza. It is a pretty good spot here for him. Price does limit his upside, but again, if you're getting like 38 minutes out of a guy at 5,800 in a matchup, he's actually been pretty solid in this season. I don't hate him here tonight. Looking at Jeff Green, Otto Porter coming back, could cut into his minutes just a little bit, but he is still just 5,100 on DraftKings, 5,800 on FanDuel. I still have him over 30 minutes. I have Otto Porter projected at 23. That means Jeff Green would get the rest of the power forward minutes at 25, and then I have him getting a couple center minutes, which boost him up to 33. Do have some interest here. Has topped 40 fantasy points in back-to-back games. Miami just 17th in defensive efficiency. 2 power forwards in the spot, and he is someone that has performed pretty well against Miami twice already this season as well. So Jeff Green, a little bit interesting. Thomas Bryant has been just downright unstoppable without Markieff Morris. He's averaging 1.17 fantasy points per minute when you take all of these Wizards guys off the floor. The biggest issue I have with Thomas Bryant is his price, and the matchup is not very good. But if he's going to be playing as many minutes as he's been playing and putting up numbers like that, it's a tough fade. Still perfectly fine in cash and tournaments. I would be a little bit wary of using him in cash, though. I think there's better places to look in that similar price range. Flipping over to the Miami side of things, definitely some interesting options here, and that starts with point guard Justice Winslow. It's so weird saying that, point guard Justice Winslow. But Justice Winslow has been pretty strong for this team of late. 6,700 on DraftKings, 7K on FanDuel. Washington obviously does struggle against point guards. They're, 30th? 28th in defensive efficiency to point guards, allowing 27.8 points, 5.9 rebounds, 9.7 assists, and 45.4% shooting from the floor, 39.1% shooting from 3. Winslow has struggled recently, or he did struggle against the Cavaliers, posting 27 fantasy points in 27 minutes, so a fantasy point per minute for this guy. In a very, very, very strong matchup. Takes a lot of his shots at the rim. 33% of his shots come at the rim. I like targeting Justice Winslow in games against bad rim protection teams. And this is a spot where I have a lot of interest in Justice Winslow. Just filling up the stat sheet, has been playing really, really well, getting you assists, rebounds, things like that. I have a lot of interest in Justice Winslow tonight. Tyler Johnson would be a name to keep an eye on if Dwayne Wade misses. He'd be a better option if Dwayne Wade misses this game. Obviously, coming off the bench, going to split a lot of usage with Dwayne Wade and now Dion Waiters, but he's still been playing pretty well of late. Has top 26 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4. Would be someone to at least keep an eye on and consider as a cheaper way to get exposure to this game. I do really like Dwayne Wade. 30% usage rate off the bench would be a very, very strong cash and tournament value here at 4,600 on DraftKings, 5,100 on FanDuel. Again, would continue to play in those mid 20s in minutes, take a lot of shots whenever he's on the floor, and it's a really, really good matchup here for him tonight. Looking at Josh Richardson, he's a guy at his price just doesn't have the upside that I would really like. That being said, like, he's still going to play a lot of minutes. I have him projected at 34. Could see, 34, 35, 36 minutes in a very good matchup. Averages just shy of a fantasy point per minute without Dragic on the floor. That's really tough to overlook in this spot in cash and tournaments, so you can roll him out tonight. Derek Jones has been playing extremely well over the last couple games. I would exercise some caution on him. He's 4,700 on DraftKings, 3,900 on FanDuel. I just don't project him to continue playing this way. He's been so inconsistent this season. Minutes just really, really, really up in the air. If he's out there producing, then he'll tend to get minutes. If he struggles early on in the game, then he doesn't get the minutes. Obviously, the Cleveland game, some of those minutes did come because of the blowout, but he's fine on FanDuel if you want to roll him out. I don't know that I would chase him here unless you're just building a bunch of lineups. Then you can get some exposure. Hassan Whiteside, always a risk for limited minutes. It's so frustrating. He has so much talent, and he can't stay on the floor some nights. And against Washington, 31 minutes, 35 fantasy points is what he's averaged in 2 games. Obviously, with Thomas Bryant being there, Jan Mahinmi getting some backup minutes, without Markieff Morris, there is potential for Whiteside to not get played off the floor. Washington ranks 26th in defensive efficiency to centers. They're giving up 48.1 rebounds per game, really struggling to defend the rim, giving up a lot of second chance points. This could be a Hassan Whiteside just monster game. I would definitely be getting some exposure in tournaments, but you can also be looking at Bam Adebayo, James Johnson, and Kelly Olynyk, who can be sprinkled into your lineups here tonight. Again, I think this is a spot where Hassan Whiteside could go bananas, and that's very, very interesting. Moving on, Dallas at Boston. Boston 5.5 point favorites in this one, 217.5 over under. Marcus Morris is going to be questionable for this game. Time Lord, Rob Williams questionable for this game, and Kyrie Irving is going to sit this one out. Doncic been pretty good. Has scored at least 17 points in 10 straight contests. I'll get to him in just a moment. Dallas not in a great spot here tonight, but I think there's still a few options that I'm definitely interested in. That does start with DeAndre Jordan, who comes in at 6,400 on DraftKings. He is pretty affordable over on FanDuel as well. Let me pull up Dallas in my notes. He is 6,800 on FanDuel. Boston, over the last 10 games, ranks 23rd in defensive efficiency to centers, allowing 26.4 points, 16.2 rebounds to the position. Without Aaron Baines, they're really, really struggling to keep these big men off the glass. And when you have a hulking beast of a big man like DeAndre Jordan, guys like Al Horford and Gershon Yabusele and like Daniel Tice and Rob Williams don't really stand much of a chance of success keeping him off the glass. I don't think people are going to look at DeAndre Jordan. I think he'll be really, really low owned. And if this game stays close, DeAndre Jordan would be a very, very, very strong candidate for a monster outing here tonight. Was on his way to a big game in Charlotte, and then Dallas won that game by like 600 points. Outside of DeAndre Jordan, I do really, really like Luka Doncic, who, like, if people are just game log watching, they're going to be like, oh, he's really struggled over the past couple games. And they're not going to look at the fact that he's played limited minutes in the last 2 games, but has still topped 30 fantasy points in both of those. 7,400 for Luka Doncic on DraftKings, 7,800 on FanDuel. That's really appealing. As you can see, has been above 8K for a large portion of his last 10 games. So getting him this cheap is really, really, really appealing. Obviously, matchup against Boston, not completely ideal, but as we've highlighted before, Boston is a team that does struggle against wings and guards that can drive to the basket, and that obviously is a boost to Luka Doncic here tonight. Wesley Matthews, really cheap option here. Boston has allowed opposing shooting guards to shoot 37.6 from three over the last 10 games. Wesley Matthews at 4,200 on DraftKings, 4,800 on FanDuel is a pretty strong tournament value here tonight. Obviously, a stretch of really poor games. But he's still taking a decent amount of three-pointers. It's not a terrible spot here for him. I do have interest in rolling him out. And then you can look at Dennis Smith Jr., JJ Barea as like tournament options. Both of these guys pretty cheap. We did see Barea just go bananas against Boston last time these teams played. Put up almost 40 fantasy points in 26 minutes. He continues to be a guy that does put up decent numbers whenever he's getting the minutes. And then also Dennis Smith Jr. coming off a really strong game against Charlotte, 35 fantasy points in 22 minutes. Was not able to suit up the last time these teams played. But again, some of these driving point guards do have success against Boston. And then you can obviously look at Harrison Barnes, 5,600 on DraftKings and 5,900 on FanDuel. A guy continues to take a lot of shots, continues to be a very strong cash game option. Flipping over to the Boston side of things, Scary Terry time, 6,100 on DraftKings. After coming off a pretty strong game last time out, he is 6,100 on FanDuel. Scary Terry, guy I have a lot of interest in. 32 minutes against Minnesota in what was not a very close game throughout the majority of the night, and he still put up a pretty strong outing. Averages just shy of a fantasy point per minute and 21% usage rate without Irving on the floor. Has averaged 35.8 fantasy points per game in 3 games without Kyrie Irving this season. Terry Rozier, especially in cash, just a guy that I'm going to be mashing into my lineups. Marcus Smart, a very strong cash game value as well. Marcus Smart, 4,300 on DraftKings, 4,800 on FanDuel. I don't hate using him in tournaments. He does have right around, I'd say, 30 to 32 fantasy point ceiling. I would expect him to get a few extra minutes than he did last game against Minnesota. Against Dallas, last time these teams faced off, he actually played really well, shot the ball really well, and he continues to be a guy who can notch you those steals and blocks along with some of the other peripheral stats. Jaylen Brown, Gordon Hayward, obviously usage boost for both of those guys without Kyrie Irving on the floor. Brown averaging 0.96 fantasy points per minute, 24.4% usage rate. Hayward, 23.3% usage rate, 1 fantasy point per minute. I have more interest in Brown for a couple reasons. One, Hayward has been just really inconsistent this season, coming off a big game. I think people are going to chase that, but Jaylen Brown at 4,800 is really appealing here. He's 4,500 on FanDuel. Again, higher usage guy off the bench. 43% of his field goal attempts come at the rim. Dallas allowing opponents to shoot 66% at the rim this season. I give the slight boost to Jaylen Brown, who wasn't terrible against Minnesota, just didn't get you a really good return on his salary, but I like Jaylen Brown in this spot as a contrarian way to get exposure to one of those wings. Again, Gordon Hayward coming in at 5,400 on DraftKings, 5,700 on FanDuel. I think is going to be a little bit more popular in this spot, and I would definitely have a little bit more interest in Jaylen Brown. Marcus Morris, Jason Tatum, perfectly fine GPP options. Jason Tatum, 6,300 on DraftKings, 6,100 on FanDuel, is appealing. Someone that I do feel like you can roll out in cash. Obviously, it kind of depends on the status of Marcus Morris. If Marcus Morris misses this game, Gordon Hayward would be a little bit of a better option. You would get more Rob Williams, Gershon Yabusele, Daniel Tice minutes, and then we could see Jason Tatum slide down to the 4, depending on who would get moved into the starting lineup. That's something that we definitely want to keep an eye on. Again, Marcus Morris, a pretty strong option, 1.12 fantasy points per minute with a 26.6% usage rate without Kyrie Irving on the floor, someone to at least consider, despite Dallas being pretty strong against opposing power forwards this season. Moving on, Orlando at Minnesota. Minnesota 5.5 point favorites in this one, 212 over under. Covington is out. Derrick Rose is doubtful. Jonathan Simmons and Jeff Teague are questionable. Timberwolves allowing 116.3 points per game over the past 4 games. They've really struggled on defense, and that's not going to get better with Robert Covington being out. Karl Anthony Towns has 5 straight 20-point efforts and 5 straight double-doubles. And Tyus Jones, 12.4 points, 7.6 assists, and 2.8 steals over his past 5 games. I have a lot of interest in the Orlando side of this game. As I mentioned, Minnesota 116.3 points per game allowed over the last few games. Obviously, without Covington there, that's going to really, really hurt their defense. And they're already giving up over the last 15 a 111.8 defensive rating. If Jeff Teague misses that game, that's also a hurt. That's also going to hurt their defense a little bit, even though Tyus Jones is a pretty strong defender. Looking at DJ Augustin, one of my favorite cash game values on the entire slate, 4,300 on DraftKings, 4,900 on FanDuel. He's just a guy always goes overlooked, and I realize there are nights where he does have a low floor. He's going to have these 12, 13 fantasy point nights from time to time. But like if you just look at his game logs over the entire season, he's a guy most nights is going to get you mid-20s with upside. He's been playing really well over his last 4 games, averaging 20 points per game. 6.5 assists, shooting 53% from the floor, 45.5% from 3. Has some of these 40-plus fantasy point games. I have a lot of interest in him here tonight as a guy that I don't think anyone's really going to look at. And again, Minnesota just giving up a lot of points, and I want to have a part of Orlando in this spot. You can definitely look at Evan Fournier, Terrence Ross, both just too cheap, I think, in their roles. The Wolves are allowing opponents to shoot 37.3% from 3. Obviously, we know Evan Fournier is second on the team in usage, takes a decent amount of 3-pointers, but at 5,300, it's a pretty appealing spot here for him tonight, coming off a stretch of games where he has not looked that great. But again, it's the Minnesota Timberwolves. He does have upside. Terrence Ross is a little bit cheaper, 4,400 on DraftKings, 5,100 on FanDuel. He's someone that I would heavily consider in this spot. Again, just going to play mid-20s in minutes, but take double-digit shots most nights, get you 20-plus fantasy points most nights. And again, I don't think people are really going to look there. Like, you're going to get a lot of Josh Okogie, and I'll get to him in a few minutes. Ownership here tonight. And Terrence Ross, just a couple hundred more. Someone that I definitely want to consider in this spot. Aaron Gordon is a touch too cheap here for his upside. Up and down most of the season, 240 fantasy point outings in his last 3 games. Minnesota does rank 20th in defensive efficiency to power forwards. He would be the guy. I think he'll be the lowest owned guy from the Orlando side of things. I don't know. Maybe. We'll have to see. But he's still playing a lot of minutes, still taking a lot of shots, getting you some assists, some rebounds, things like that. It's a really good spot here for Aaron Gordon. I do have interest, 7,100 on DraftKings. 7,600 on FanDuel. Unfortunately, just his lack of consistency this season has me concerned about using him in cash. I did glaze over Jonathan Isaac. He's someone that I think is a pretty strong value in this spot. Small forwards have shot 45.8% from the floor, 41.1% from 3 against Minnesota this season. Isaac, not a guy taking a ton of threes, but he could have one of these nights where he does take 3, 4, 5 3-pointers. Hit a couple of these extra shots, and he's going to get you some of these blocks, steals, things like that. He does have some upside in the spot at 3,700. Maybe falls into a couple extra minutes if Jonathan Simmons misses this game. Lastly, we do have to talk about Nikola Vucevic, who continues to lead the team in usage, continues to be just an absolute monster this season. 26.7% usage rate. Matchup not great, but he just continues to be just a really strong option on a nightly basis. Did struggle against Charlotte, played limited minutes, got hurt in that game, but came out, against Chicago, just went completely bananas. Has a couple of down games in spots, but generally speaking, pretty safe for 40-plus fantasy points on a nightly basis. And at 9,300, I like the upside he has here tonight. Looking at the Minnesota side of things, obviously not the best, not one of the best spots here for Karl Anthony Towns. But that really hasn't slowed him down at all. As I mentioned, has just been ridiculous of late, scoring 20-plus points in 5 straight games, 5 straight double-doubles. Monster usage guy, averaging 61.2 points, 61.2 fantasy points on 26.5 points, 5.8 assists, 15 rebounds, 52% three-point shooting, and 53% field goal percentage overall over his last 6 games, 35.3% usage rate, 1.56 fantasy points per minute without Rose and Covington on the floor. Obviously, he's going to play a ton of minutes if the game stays close. He's going to take a ton of shots, going to pull down a decent amount of boards. Karl-Anthony Towns, a tough fade here at 9,900 on DraftKings. I believe he is up over 10K on FanDuel. Let me pull up FanDuel here. Yeah, he's 10-6 on FanDuel. He does get an even bigger boost if Jeff Teague sits this one out. Owns a 38.6% usage rate and 1.67 fantasy points per minute whenever you take Teague off the floor and combine that with no Covington and Rose. If that happens, I would be deathly afraid of fading Karl-Anthony Towns in this spot tonight. Towns going to be a guy that I do have interest in building around. Andrew Wiggins, a strong option here. Obviously better for GPPs because he's Andrew Wiggins, but 30.2% usage rate, 1.03 fantasy points per minute without Rose and Covington. Orlando allowing opposing small forwards to shoot 43.2% from the floor, 37.9% from three. Andrew Wiggins, 6,600 on DraftKings, 6,500 on FanDuel is a pretty strong option here. Has been over 30 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4. Gonna take a lot of shots and play a lot of minutes. I mentioned Josh Okogie. He's fine in tournaments. He's fine if you want to use him in cash. Should play more minutes than he did against Boston. Got a little bit of foul trouble. Just was largely ineffective. I have him projected at 32 minutes. It's fine. I'm probably going to fade him because I think there's other value that's a little bit safer, but does have some potential to put up a big game. Tyus Jones would be another core option, has top 30 fantasy points in each of his last 3 starts, would play 36 to 40 minutes if Jeff Teague misses this game. So yeah, you know you can go back to Tyus Jones if Teague is out, which hopefully we get that news early on today. Moving on, Brooklyn at Memphis. Memphis 3-point favorites, 207.5 over under. Rondae Hollis-Jefferson is out. Mike Conley listed as questionable but expected to play. Chandler Parsons is out. Alan Crabb and Karis LeVert are out as well. Last time these teams played, it went into overtime. Ended up being 131-125. Mike Conley had 37 points, 10 assists. Mike Conley is dealing with the shoulder injury, was sitting on the bench last game, went to the locker room once or twice, had his shoulder iced, shot really, really bad. He's fine in tournaments. It's Mike Conley. He does have upside. Outside of that, obviously, you're looking at Marc Gasol, really, really inconsistent of late, and that's still giving up a league high 63.4 fantasy points per game to opposing centers, and they rank 29th in defensive efficiency against the position. You can look at Marc Gasol if you so choose. He is 8,100 on DraftKings, 8,400 on FanDuel. I have interest in him. Obviously, it is a pretty strong spot for him tonight. Kyle Anderson, Jaren Jackson, 2 guys that I do have a lot of interest in. Kyle Anderson, 5,200 on DraftKings, 6,200 on FanDuel. Just a guy continues to produce solid numbers, taking a decent amount of shots. It's not a terrible matchup here for him tonight. Mostly just a cash guy, but he does have potential to put up, a big game. I do have interest in Kyle Anderson. And then Jaren Jackson, much better play on FanDuel, even though he's a little bit more expensive, where the blocks count for a little bit more. But 5,600 on DraftKings, I have a lot of interest in him here. There are a decent amount of guys from Brooklyn that take a lot of shots at the rim. You do have, Jared Allen, Ed Davis, Rodions Kurucs, Spencer Dinwiddie, guys that take over 30% of their shots at the rim. Joe Harris, 32% of his shots at the rim. That's going to lead to a few extra block opportunities for him. And then he himself takes a decent amount of shots at the rim. Brooklyn's rim protection numbers are still pretty solid, but have fallen off a little bit. But more importantly, they're one of the worst teams in the NBA defending in the paint and the mid-range, where he does take a decent amount of shots. 30% of his shots come in those 2 areas. I have a lot of interest in him here tonight. Yeah, it's just a good spot here for Jaren Jackson. I really, really, really like Jaren Jackson. Garrett Temple, Dillon Brooks, strong values, but I'm not really forcing exposure to them in this spot. Looking at the Brooklyn side, obviously you can look at D'Angelo Russell and Spencer Dinwiddie. D'Angelo Russell did torch the Grizzlies last time out. He does have a penchant for stepping up in some of these really, really tough matchups. Well, you can roll him out in tournaments. You can roll Spencer Dinwiddie in cash. No one from this game is going to project to be very good. It's a low-scoring game. Memphis, one of the like one of the worst teams to try to attack in the NBA. But again, we can still look at him. A couple of guys here. We can also look at DeMarre Carroll, who's been really, really strong. Memphis, one of the areas that they do struggle is on corner threes. They're allowing opponents to shoot 39.5% on corner threes. That's a pretty big boost to DeMarre Carroll. 4,700 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel. We saw him come out against the Pelicans, play really well. I do feel like he can get you 30 plus fantasy points in this spot. So he is pretty much the only guy that I have interest in, even in cash, from the Brooklyn side of things here tonight. Moving on, Atlanta at Milwaukee. Milwaukee 14-point favorites in this one, 230.5 over under. Taurean Prince, Ken Bazemore continue to be out. Ersan Ilyasova is questionable. Alex Len averaging 18.3 points and 7.3 rebounds in 25.3 minutes over his last 3 games. John Collins has produced at least 20 points in 10 of 13 games since the start of December. He's been playing really, really well. Brook Lopez has been playing really well. 14 for 27 from beyond the arc over the last 2 games compared to just 1 for 3 on 2-point attempts. He's just lighting it up from 3. Trae Young has at least 9 assists in 7 of his last 11 games. With the Hawks being shorthanded, obviously don't expect this game to stay close. Does take away some of the upside for some of these guys. There are still some spots where we can look. We like to target guys that score a lot in the mid-range, and we like to target guys that score on corner threes against Milwaukee. Those are the areas that you can really, really attack. Dwayne Dedmon, Jeremy Lin, and Kevin Huerter are the 3 main options that stand out in those spots. Dedmon was outshined by Alex Len last time out. I still think he's a pretty solid option here. 1.23 fantasy points per minute when you take Bazemore and Prince off the floor. 29% of his shots come in the paint or the mid-range. So that bodes really, really, really well here for him tonight. And then 12% of his shots are corner threes. So he's a guy that I don't think is going to garner a ton of ownership. 5,500 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel. Projects to be a pretty strong play. Obviously, again, did get outshined by Alex Len last time out, but wasn't terrible. 27 minutes, 9 rebounds, 6 points. Didn't shoot the ball particularly well, but still not a terrible game. I have interest in Dwayne Dedmon here tonight. Jeremy Lin's usage and fantasy point per minute numbers obviously slightly inflated because he does a lot of the stuff off the bench, but 25.1% usage rate, 1.18 fantasy points per minute. Price is up, 4,100 on DraftKings, 4,600 on FanDuel. Started off really well last game and then kind of trickled off towards the end. It was a little bit of a blowout against Washington, but he's going to get you 22-ish minutes most nights. Going to shoot a little bit better than he has over the past couple games, and he's another guy. A lot of shots in the mid-range, a lot of shots on corner threes. Pretty strong value here tonight. Looking at Kevin Huerter, played at least 40 minutes in back-to-back games, takes 38% of his shots in the paint, mid-range, or on corner threes. He doesn't have a lot of upside. He just hasn't been able to reach, hasn't been able to put up really, really strong games, but he's playing like 40 minutes a night, and that's really appealing, even though it is Milwaukee. It's not a great matchup, but again, he's someone else. A lot of shots in the paint, a lot of shots in the mid-range. He's definitely someone that I have my eye on in this spot. 4,600 on DraftKings, 5K on FanDuel. Trae Young, obviously a tough matchup, but 32% usage rate, really tough to ignore. The assist numbers, really tough to ignore. 5,900 on DraftKings, really tough to ignore. I don't hate taking a shot on Trae Young in tournaments. Shot did not fall against Washington, but a few games before that was shooting the ball really well, was playing pretty darn well against the Pacers, Cleveland, Minnesota, some of these defenses. So I have interest in him as well. Just more of a tournament option for me tonight. And then you can look at, like on FanDuel, you can look at Daniel Hamilton. You can look at Vince Carter, guys that would be value plays. And then obviously John Collins. Fell short of another double-double last game, but just monster upside in the spot. Milwaukee has actually struggled. They're third in fantasy points per game allowed to power forwards on the season. Flipping over to the Milwaukee side of things, Giannis is Giannis. Averaged 27 points, 12.7 rebounds, 5.3 assists in 3 games against the Hawks last season. Gonna play, 30 plus minutes, 34, 35, 36 if the game somehow stays close. Monster upside, monster ceiling. Um, it's Giannis. Like, if you want to play him, you play him. I'm probably going to be going a little bit more balanced in this spot tonight, though. One of the guys that I do have my eye on, Malcolm Brogdon, one of my favorite mid-range options on a nightly basis. Just too cheap for his consistency and upside. 5,800 on DraftKings, 5,700 on FanDuel. He just always goes overlooked. He's a guy that's going to get you 30-plus minutes most nights, especially in close games. Has 30-plus fantasy point upside. Has the potential, he's going to get you at least like 20 most nights, 25 most nights. Hasn't fallen below 25 more than twice in his last 10 games. I mean, he's just really, really consistent, and that's just something to keep an eye on, especially in cash games. And Atlanta ranks 28th in defensive efficiency to shooting guard, so it's a pretty good matchup. Chris Middleton, kind of shaken out of his shooting slump, has connected on 55.2% of his overall field goal attempts and 35% of his three-point attempts over the last 4 games. Atlanta allowing opponents to connect on 37.4% of their three-point attempts, and they rank 18th in defensive efficiency to small forwards on the season. It's a good spot here for Chris Middleton, 7,300 on DraftKings, 7,400 on FanDuel. I don't find him, he didn't make it into my lineups, not someone that I have a ton of interest in getting a lot of exposure to, but he's a pretty strong tournament option. Same with Eric Bledsoe. Slumping a little bit late. Atlanta ranks 29th in defensive efficiency. I'm fine with Eric Bledsoe in cash and tournaments, 6,600 on DraftKings, 7,200 on FanDuel. And then Brook Lopez, I mentioned, has been shooting the lights out recently. He's a pretty strong tournament option in this spot. Obviously, we know Atlanta really, really bad against opposing centers. Moving on to a stretch of games that is really, really appealing. Clippers at Phoenix. Clippers 4-point favorites in this one, 233 over under. Looking at the Clippers side of things first, Danilo Gallinari tallied over 20 points in 7 of the past 9 games. Lou Williams has topped 20 points in 5 of the past 7 games. And then on the Phoenix side, Devin Booker, 10 straight 20-point outings, averaging 29.3 points per game over that span. I'll get to Booker in just a minute, but looking at the Clippers side of things, it's the same guys every single night. We're always going to be looking at Tobias Harris, Danilo Gallinari, Lou Williams, and Montrezl Harrell. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Patrick Beverley and Avery Bradley, Boban, Gortat, like these guys are just guys. None of them are getting enough minutes or producing enough to make me want to talk about them on a nightly basis. And Doc Rivers, for whatever reason, has shown absolutely no rhyme or reason to, or consistency to which center is going to get the start on a nightly basis. So I'm always going to be looking at the main 4 guys: Tobias, Danilo, Lou, and Harrell. Harrell has struggled recently to see consistent minutes, but Phoenix ranks 2nd in fantasy points per game allowed to centers, 30th in defensive efficiency. They're giving up 25.8 points per game, 16.7 rebounds to the position. Excellent roll man, operating as the roll man on 22% of the possessions. Suns 1.27 points per possession allowed to the roll man. Montrezl Harrell is 7,200 on DraftKings, 7,400 on FanDuel, is a pretty strong cash game option with some tournament upside in this spot. I have interest in Montrezl Harrell if he fits my lineups, but most likely I'm going to be looking at Lou Williams, 6,700 on FanDuel, 6,800 on DraftKings, as a guy that I have a lot of interest in, and then Danilo Gallinari, 7K on DraftKings, 7,300 on FanDuel. Again, has been shooting really, really well recently. Phoenix really struggling against 3-point shooters. Gallinari has been one of the better 3-point shooters in the NBA this season. He's a guy that I do have a lot of interest in to get some exposure to the Clippers side of this game, obviously. And then I mentioned Lou Williams, 30% usage rate off the bench, has played 7 games since returning from injury, has topped 36 fantasy points in all but 2 of those games. I did touch on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in the notes. He's not getting really the minutes I'd like to see, but still a strong tournament option here. 4,200 on DraftKings, 4,400 on FanDuel. I have him projected at 25 minutes right now. If he could get closer to 30, that would be great, because Phoenix really struggles to defend the rim. And he takes over his 30% of his shots there. Phoenix allowing almost 66% shooting at the rim. If he can find a way to stay out of foul trouble and get to 26, 28, maybe closer to 30 minutes, this could be a really good spot for him. He Played 31 minutes, has played 31 minutes in both games against the Suns this season, 32 fantasy points. I don't hate taking a shot on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in this spot. Uh, Outside of that, I don't really have interest in Beverly or Bradley outside of using them on like FanDuel where their salaries could get dropped. And then the same with Boban. 3,400 in tournaments. If you want to take a shot on Boban, that's fine. But as you can see, just there's no consistency at all to the minutes that he's going to be getting. Some nights it's teens, some nights it's 20, some nights it's single digits. There's no rhyme or reason to it at all. Like, I don't know what Doc Rivers is doing. No one knows what Doc Rivers is doing. Doc Rivers doesn't know what Doc Rivers is doing. But moving on to the Phoenix side of things, lots of interest in Phoenix here. Devin Booker just been ridiculous. He's been unstoppable, averaging 48.5 fantasy points on 28.8 points, 8 assists, 3.8 rebounds, 40% three-point shooting, and 48% field goal percentage over the last 5 games. Clippers struggling against opposing point guards. I call Devin Booker a point guard because that's what Devin Booker is. They rank 23rd in defensive efficiency to the position. Devin Booker, a guy that I do find myself hitting that lock button on, especially if you're looking on FanDuel at 8,800, but over on DraftKings, 9K, still pretty appealing here for Devin Booker. Just a guy I feel pretty confident is going to get me close to 50 fantasy points on a nightly basis. So Devin Booker, very, very strong option here. I really like DeAndre Ayton, 7,800 on DraftKings, 8K on FanDuel. Really, really good spot here for him. Clippers 27th in defensive efficiency to centers, allowing 25.2 points, 15.1 rebounds, 52% field goal percentage. He's been on a heater. Obviously, coming off a couple tough matchups. Philly was not a great matchup for him, still really strong outing. Denver was not a great matchup for him, still pretty strong outing. OKC, not a great matchup for him, pretty strong outing, but he's just been playing really well, has a lot of upside, especially at that $7,800 price tag, and has been pretty good against the Clippers twice this season, averaging 29 minutes and 35 fantasy points. Rashawn Holmes can be looked at as value. Still going to play 14 to 16 minutes most nights. Still a guy getting you like a fantasy point per minute when he's on the floor. TJ Warren, we saw him struggle last game against Philly. Only played 20 minutes. We saw Josh Jackson come in and eat into his minutes. I don't anticipate that being a thing going forward. TJ Warren, perfectly fine tournament option. Josh Jackson, a perfectly fine tournament option as well. Mikal Bridges is fine in cash. Still going to play a decent amount of minutes. And then DeAnthony Melton, a really, really strong value here, coming in at 3,700 on DraftKings, 4,500 on FanDuel. He's playing decent minutes. Has top 20 fantasy points in 3 straight. Been playing mid to upper 20s in minutes most nights. Obviously, he's going to have some of these down games. OKC, Orlando, Brooklyn, some of these games where he was really bad. But like, if I feel comfortable that a guy like Melton can get me 20 plus fantasy points at 3,700, I have some interest in him here tonight. So DeAnthony Melton, a pretty strong value. Looking at OKC Portland before we get to the last game of the night, because OKC Portland won't take too terribly long. Portland 1 point favorite in this one, 223.5 over under. Paul George has top 20 points in each of his past 12 games, averaging 32.1 points during that stretch. Westbrook has shot 30% or worse in 4 of the past 7 games, has been just really, really poor shooting. Nurkic, solid 4-game run, averaging 21.5 points, 13 rebounds, 5.3 assists, 1.8 blocks, and 1.8 steals while shooting 56.6% from the field. OKC side is always the same. You're looking at 4 guys. You're looking at Paul George, Russell Westbrook, Jeremy Grant, Steven Adams. Very rare, and I guess Dennis Schroeder if you're really, really hunting, but very rarely are you looking anywhere else. Paul George, my favorite option here. Portland, obviously Paul George has been on fire, top 50 fantasy points in 6 of his last 10 games, but the spot where I really like to attack Portland is the small forward position. They rank 26th in defensive efficiency. 2 small forwards have allowed them to shoot 45.9% from the floor and 41% from 3. That makes Paul George one of my favorite options here, and he continues to go overlooked, under-owned on most nights. He's a guy who just can get you 50-plus fantasy points pretty easily. Russell Westbrook, again, walking triple-double, despite shooting just 39.6 from the floor and 23 44.3% from three over his last 6 games, has been able to put up really, really monster outings still. Because it's Russell Westbrook, you can roll him out in cash in tournaments if you want. Jeremy Grant, Steven Adams, excellent cash options. Grant being especially strong cash mid-range option here. Portland 27th in defensive efficiency. 2 centers on the season. Jeremy Grant at 5K, a guy that is going to get you 20 plus fantasy points most nights. And that's OKC pretty much every single night for the rest of the year. Looking at the Portland side of things, I do have interest in CJ McCollum, 6,400 on DraftKings, 6,400 on FanDuel. We've seen especially recently, OKC really struggling to defend some of these shooting wings. We saw KCP go off against him. We've seen guys like Iman Shumpert just go completely bananas against him. And CJ McCollum has been in a shooting slump, but I still have some interest in him. 22% of his shots do come in the paint. OKC allowing 41.3% shooting in those areas, and they have struggled against shooting guards on the season. Again, I have interest in him in tournaments only. Damian Lillard has been struggling of late, but 8 20-point performances in the last 10 games. He's still going to score a lot, still take a decent amount of shots. 8,600 for Damian Lillard on DraftKings, 8,800 on FanDuel is appealing. Amin Yu is fine in like as a tournament or as a cash value, but Yusuf Nurkic might be a guy that garners some ownership. 8K on DraftKings, 9,100 on FanDuel, just because he's been playing really well, especially after that Sacramento game. But he's fine in tournaments. OKC has allowed 45.2 rebounds per game to opponents over the last 10 games. That's a little bit of an increase. We've seen guys like Josh Hart, Brandon Ingram has some success rebounding against Nurkic. Obviously, it's a very, very tough matchup, but if you're looking to try to get some exposure to this game, Nurkic could be fine. It's just not somewhere that I think we really need to look, and I think he could garner a little bit more ownership than he should. Looking at the next game, Knicks at Lakers. This is the game that I think everyone wants to talk about, everyone wants to stack, everyone's going to really want to get some exposure to. Lakers 8.5-point favorites in this one, 225.5 over under. We have Mitchell Robinson questionable, Kyle Kuzma questionable, LeBron James, Michael Beasley, and Rajon Rondo all out. Luke Cornett averaging 18.7 points over the last 3 games. I'm going to start with him. He is a little bit pricey. Obviously, Lakers a great spot for opposing centers. They give up 47.4 rebounds and are allowing almost 60 fantasy points per game to the position. Luke Cornett, 5,400 on DraftKings, 5,500 on FanDuel. I am perfectly fine rolling him out in cash in tournaments. He has been over 30 fantasy points in his last 3 starts, including really tough matchups against Utah and Denver. Luke Cornett seems like a guy that I feel pretty confident is going to have a decent game here. Noah Vonleh has played 30 plus minutes in some of the last 10 games. Lakers not great against power, or not terrible against power forwards. They're giving up like 17 points and 11.4 rebounds to the position over the last 5 games. Might get a little bit better if Kyle Kuzma misses this game. Noah Vonleh perfectly fine cash and tournament option. Lakers do rank 25th in defensive efficiency. 2 small forwards, allowing them to shoot 45.3% from the floor, 39% from 3. Kevin Knox comes out and just lights up the first half and then just disappears in the second. I don't know what it is. He can't score in the second half. He's still playing a ton of minutes, and it's a fast-paced game. A lot of scoring opportunities. I have interest in Kevin Knox, who has struggled recently. Really since like that Atlanta game just has not been great. But for the amount of minutes he's playing, 5,900 on DraftKings, 5,800 on FanDuel, really appealing here tonight. You can look at Tim Hardaway Jr. continues to deal with like plantar fasciitis. Always just going to be a GPP option because of that. Always just going to be a GPP option because he's pretty reliant most nights on scoring. Does have some of these games where he does get you the rebounds, but it's mostly just volume scoring. The Lakers do struggle against shooting guards, allowing them to shoot 39.5% from 3. That is a boost to Tim Hardaway, so he's perfectly fine. Moutier's kind of a fade for me. There's going to be point guards that I don't really want to take against the Lakers, and that's going to be Emmanuel Mudiay. You can roll him out in cash at his elevated price tag if you want, but I just don't really have interest. Lakers really, really good defensively against point guards. Lonzo Ball, a really, really underrated defender. Looking at the Lakers side of this, it's a lot really depends on the status of Kyle Kuzma. If he plays, 31% usage rate, 1.20 fantasy points per minute without LeBron and Rondo. Knicks, 30th in defensive efficiency to power forwards. Would be really, really, really tough to overlook him in this spot. He's still pretty affordable. He is 7,300 on DraftKings, 6,900 on FanDuel. If he plays, which we may not even know ahead of time, he would be a really, really strong option here. I really like Brandon Ingram and Lonzo Ball, regardless of his status. Both guys perfectly fine in cash and perfectly fine in tournaments. Ingram, 31.1% usage rate, 1.06 fantasy points per minute without Kuzma, so obviously does see a little bit of a boost. I would not be fading Brandon Ingram if Kyle Kuzma misses this game. Same with Lonzo Ball, two guys that you could just build around if Kuzma misses. Again, I don't hate Lonzo Ball in this spot even if Kuzma plays. The lack of rim protection is a boost to both of those guys. Despite the limited minutes he's been playing, JaVale McGee has been fantastic recently. Has topped 30 fantasy points in both games since returning to the team. If Kyle Kuzma sits, JaVale McGee has a 30% usage rate. If Kyle Kuzma plays, JaVale McGee is still 27.6% usage rate. Yeah, JaVale McGee should feast in this spot. He's a guy that on DraftKings at 5,200, I don't think I'm going to be fading. 65 on FanDuel, I can make a case for it, but does have a lot of upside in the spot. Again, Knicks really, really bad against opposing centers. It's giving up a lot of rebounds, 47.4 rebounds, second chance points. And there's a decent amount of guys that take a lot of shots at the rim. Noah Vonleh, Emmanuel Mudiay, Kevin Knox, a lot of guys that take a lot of shots at the rim. So there's some block upside for him tonight. KCP is going to be popular. I don't think there's really any way around it. 4,900 on DraftKings, 4,500 on FanDuel, given how well he's played the last couple games. I'm still fine using him, especially if he's going to be coming off the bench, and especially if Kyle Kuzma misses this game. Josh Hart can be used in all formats, 6,200 on DraftKings. He is 6,400 on FanDuel, still a pretty strong option, still really, really secure in his minutes, and a really good matchup against a really bad Knicks team. But that's going to do it. Obviously, we're waiting on some news, the Kyle Kuzma news being the most important, but good luck at all your contests, and I will be back tomorrow.